Welcome, everyone, to episode 9 of Bridges Not Walls, our Charleston Jewish Community Relations vlogcast. I'm excited to be with you again this Friday. Excited for the guest that we have with us. As you know, the ethos behind this Bridges Not Walls effort is to build bridges, and rather than building walls in response to everything that's happening around us. And this week with us is somebody that I respect a great deal, who lives by the same ethos, and I'm excited for you all to get a chance to hear from him and to have this interview on the record for eternity, essentially. So much of what we've been able to do together hasn't been necessarily recorded, so this is going to be great. Just a couple of news items. I apologize in advance. We're all reeling a little bit here at Federation's office. We suffered a loss in our Jewish community today. I'm sure there'll be more information about that later today or tomorrow. But in the broader world, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is visiting the United States this week. It's been a little chaotic because, as everybody I'm sure is aware of and paying attention to, we've had some major developments in the presidential race. President Biden decided that he was not going to run for a second term, and Vice President Kamala Harris is all but the new Democratic nominee for president. She's been looking at who her vice president is going to be. And in the midst of all of this news, Prime Minister Netanyahu arrived in the States to address Congress. Back home, people are protesting still, demanding that Prime Minister Netanyahu sign a deal to bring hostages home and to bring an end to the war in Gaza. And so his visit is there's a backdrop of a lot of things going on. As he addressed Congress this week, there were more protests outside of the speech, specifically in Union Station in DC, where folks were waving Hamas flags, unfortunately, and calling upon iconography referencing Hamas. Vice President Harris took the opportunity to condemn these protests. So there's a lot going on in Washington. Yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu met with Vice President Harris and President Biden, and today he'll meet with former President Trump in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. All of that aside, here in Charleston, we have a congressional race that is underway. And yesterday or the day before, we were very proud to announce that we have secured the commitment of both Representative Nancy Mace and Michael B. Moore, her opponent, to participate in a candidate forum for our Jewish community. It's open to all folks, however. It will be moderated by Carolyn Murray of News 2 and will take place downtown at BSBI Synagogue on Rutledge Avenue. The date for that is August 22nd. That's a Thursday at 7 p.m. You can register, and you should register, because there will be a limited number of seats available. I'm going to drop the link here below. This is it right here, the short link. It is bit.ly/Mace Moore Forum. When you register, you will have the opportunity to submit a question in the registration form. And while I'm sure we're not going to ask every question that's submitted, certainly it will help determine the questions as we receive questions from the community. So, for example, if we get 20 or 30 or 40 submissions that are about Israel or anti-Semitism or the economy or inflation, we're sure to formulate a question in that subject area to ask Representative Mace and Mr. Moore. So make sure you take the opportunity to submit a question, even if you're not going to be able to make it. All folks who attend are going to have to register in advance. As you can imagine, with the current climate of anti-Semitism and security, I mean, think back to just a few weeks ago when someone tried to assassinate former President Trump. We will be maintaining a high level of security for this event. Everybody will have to have registered in advance, and we'll have to pass through a security checkpoint when they step into the synagogue. So that is for the safety of the candidates, the safety of all those who attend. I'm sure you understand. And having said that, we are planning a candidate forum for Charleston County Sheriffs to take place on September 18th. We do not have a location for that yet, but stay tuned in, and we'll figure something out and be able to share that with you soon. And that's pretty much all the updates that I have for you all today. And I want to give more time for us to be able to speak with our guest today. He is Professor Damon Fordham. He is a historian, educator, a friend of mine, and he currently teaches classes at the Citadel, our local military college. Professor Fordham has released a number of books on the history of South Carolina. Has shared the stories of many people whose stories haven't been published before. He tells stories vocally and performs his harmonium along with the stories, or is it a melodica? I'm sure he'll tell me in a second. And he also is available to give Black History walking tours of Charleston when he has time. So if you enjoy what you hear today, be sure to get in touch with Professor Fordham to do a walking tour, especially if you have family members in town. So without further ado, I'm going to bring to the stage Professor Fordham. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I have some questions that I wrote in advance, but why don't you take the opportunity to introduce yourself in case I didn't do the best job introducing you?
Well, you did an excellent job as far as I'm concerned. But my name is Damon Fordham. I'm the adjunct professor of history at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. Born in Spartanburg, adopted as an infant, raised in Mount Pleasant. I have written 4 books that are out right now, including a 5th one that is on the way out in January. It's entitled The Black Folk Tales and Chronicles of South Carolina. It will be out on January the 14th, 2025 from History Arcadia Press. And my walking tour is called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston, which is go through Buxton Books, which is on 160 King Street, downtown Charleston. If anyone's interested in that, I'll give you the number to that at the end of this broadcast. And in general, I'm a public educator as well as an adjunct professor. I educate people through my YouTube channel, The American Storyteller on YouTube, as well as through my forums on Facebook, and as well as Twitter, X, and Instagram under my own name.
Well, I am losing count of the number of books that you've published, and I feel like every time I talk to you, there's a new one in the works. But the first question that I wanted to ask you, although you're an author and a historian, professor, and you operate very much in the context of academia, your work is unique in that you collect people's stories and the narratives of individuals throughout history to tell the story of history. And you obviously have a unique talent for telling stories aloud in your walking tours, on YouTube. It's kind of your signature. And in this storytelling, you've spoken a lot about griots. What is a griot, and do you consider yourself a part of that tradition?
Yes, the griots are
Griot.
no worries. Every ancient culture has had their tradition of storytellers who educate through storytelling and wisdom. Even going back in your tradition, the Torah, as you probably know, originally came from the oral tradition of the people of Judea during the several millennia BCE. And in West Africa, the equivalent of that were the griots. And they would basically sit in the middle of the village and tell people various stories going back to thousands of years, in many cases, of their communities, the kings, the queens, and so forth. One famous griot named Mamadou Kouyate said in Mali in 1959 that we are the memory of mankind and we are vessels of speech, and through us, the tales of the kings and the queens and the subjects would die in obscurity. So I spent a lot of time in West Africa over the last couple of summers with amazing griots such as Dr. Ousmane Sene at the West African Cultural Center in Dakar in Senegal, West Africa, as well as one that I met in over in let's see, in Gambia, as a matter of fact, a gentleman by the name of, let's see, what was his name? His name just sort of escapes me at the moment. Oh, yeah. Name was Lamine Ng, who was a griot from that area. A number of these people I learned from and got these stories from, but it goes back to when I was a child. I would listen to the elders tell very fascinating stories, you see. And from that, I grew into a love of storytelling and such, as well as reading some of the same stories. So I was one of the last generation to listen to elders do that sort of thing. And so it's a tradition that I strongly believe in carrying on for the general education of the public.
Well, it's certainly a captivating and effective method of telling stories. And I know that some stories have only been passed on vocally from person to person, and haven't really made it into books. And you're right. I think a great deal of our religious text is actually dictated from oral tradition, especially the Talmud. Um, what so obviously one of the reasons that you continue to talk about history, and have shared history, not just through your work, but also in your personal life, in showing up to activist events, in talking to young people who are trying to make social change. What role does history have in the decisions that we make as a society today? I think this is an especially important question because just in the past couple of years, we've seen it surge in book bans. Just this past year, AP African American History was defunded by the state of South Carolina, and is dealing with the same thing in Georgia, Florida, and Arkansas. What apologies? What place does the censorship? So, what place does history have in the decisions we make today, and what place does censorship of history have in our history?
All right, I'm going to make this as concise as possible because, I don't believe in speaking.
Unlike my question.
No, it's all right. It's all right. No, because see, I'm one of these people who does not believe in speaking to the general public in terms of academic speak, because you have to speak to people in the language that they understand. So having said all of that, history is of great importance in this because, Malcolm X once said that of all of the professions, history is best qualified to our research. And people don't understand that one of the things that's been constant throughout the history of humanity is human nature. And thus we tend to repeat cycles over and over again unless we are warned of where these things can lead. Right now, for example, you have the situation where the person who was supposed to run for president resigned from doing so. There was a war that split the country. There was internal division on a major scale. And I'm talking here about 1968. And in 2024, almost to the letter, the problems that we had in 1968 have resurfaced as a cycle. Now, as far as young people and activism, young people today are in the same activist mode as the young people of the 1960s. So it's important that they learn both the strengths from what was accomplished doing that, but they should also learn the pitfalls that are to avoided that were made during those days, cases of egoism and infiltration and the internal and destruction of youth movements as such. That needs to be repeated to the youth of today to avoid them going down that same path, but their strengths are needed to be told in order for them to build upon that, to give them a blueprint on where to go and where not to go. Now, in regards to the censorship of history, part of the reason that we got where we are today is that much of what happened after the Civil War was censored from our history books because a lady named Mildred Rutherford and the United Daughters of the Confederacy suppressed anything that was not favorable to the Confederacy. In fact, they even went so far as to glorify the Ku Klux Klan in the South Carolina history books by Mary Sims Oliphant that I used when I was in school. So therefore, since people didn't know of the type of things that happened as a result, they're again repeating these same things over and over again by the banning of legitimate history in many of our schools. Now, as far as banning Black history from the schools, one of the reasons that they're giving for that is that they say it may upset white children. Two things. Number one, when my history books in South Carolina in 1978, when I was in the 8th grade at Moultrie Middle School, said that the Klan arrived because the, quote, Negroes had lost their heads and the Klan was necessary in order to preserve order, well, how do you think that that made most of us feel? Secondly, a person who thinks that the teaching of Black history will demoralize white children shows ignorance on their part and not, that they don't know what they're talking about, because an honest Black history will also show the role of the white abolitionists, the friendship of people such as Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, who were killed in Mississippi with James Chaney in 1964 for voting rights, as well as that of Viola Liuzzo, a white lady from Tennessee who later moved to Detroit, whose daughter Sally, I might add, is a good friend of mine. She was killed helping Black people in Alabama in 1965, as well as Judge Julius Waitie's Waring here in Charleston, who was run out of town in 1952 for his assistance to Black people. So a true telling of Black history, along with the comradeship of these individuals who helped in that, goes to show not so much an anti-white history, but a pro-human history that shows what happens when we all come together.
Well said. I think that we in the Jewish community have a particular attachment to the tradition of telling of history, especially history that makes us uncomfortable. As a kid growing up, it was drilled into my head that, we were never allowed to forget what happened just a couple generations before us in the Holocaust. We have an obligation to share these stories and tell this history with the intention of it not happening again. I think we inherently understand that suppression of history almost dooms us to repeat the same mistakes again. And your point about the Democratic nominee for president stepping down, the irony isn't lost on me that here we are in 2024, and the Democratic convention is about to happen in Chicago, where in 1968 the convention happened, and Johnson had stepped down from his candidacy for president after serving one full term, and there are sure to be protests, just like there were outside of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where some folks will remember young Jewish activists like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin led tremendous protests that ended up with a great deal of violent clashes and injuries and arrests. Hopefully, that violence is not repeated in 2024. But there's not a first time for almost anything. And was it in 1968 too when was it in 1968 when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated?
June 5th, 1968, Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles.
And here we have, again, people shooting at presidential candidates in the United States, tragically. So you've written extensively about the stories of people who have come before us, who have special places in history. I wasn't able to read the full draft of your book, but one of the things that stuck out to me was your retelling of the stories of the folks who testified in the Denmark VC trial.
Right.
And I'm curious how you would concisely tell your story growing up in Charleston, how you arrived at the profession you're in now, and what inspired you along the way.
All right, I'll give you the 3-minute version of that. I grew up, the parents who adopted and raised me, Pearl and Abraham Fordham, they were old enough to be my grandparents, see. And so they were at the tail end of that tradition of Black folkloric storytelling that was a mainstay of our community for many years. And so I grew up listening to them tell not only stories about the family and their own experiences, which mirrored that of World War II and the Great Depression and the pre-Civil Rights Movement era, but they were also telling interesting folk tales too that I later learned were constant within the Black community. So then in 1977, at the age of 12 and a half, going on 13, I was at the Village Library in Mount Pleasant and read a book called Mules and Men by Zora Neale Hurston, as well as A Treasury of American Folklore by B.A. Botkin. And the B.A. Botkin book had the stories of Pecos Bill and Davy Crockett and Johnny Appleseed that many of us knew from Walt Disney. And then the Zora Neale Hurston book was when she went to Eatonville, Florida, to collect the Black folk tales from the elders that she grew up with. And I saw the connection with all of these stories. So that's what made me see what was special about this. But there came a point where my parents' generation died out. Most of the 60s and 70s generation didn't have an interest in that, and I did. So unfortunately, a lot of that died out. And so I saw the importance of preserving this. So I decided to put that in these books. And then when I was at the University of South Carolina, I met Dean Willie Harriford, was my mentor of the Black Studies Department. And he was the one who encouraged my love for history to be my profession. And so with all that, here I am. And then when I went to Africa and met both the griots of the rural areas, as well as people like I mentioned, Dr. Usman Sene at the West African Cultural Research Center, that really inspired me, especially when Lamin Inde, if you remember the whole thing with Roots and Alex Haley, Lamin Inde, who is a griot in Gambia, is a direct descendant of Alex Haley's ancestor Kunta Kinte, who was brought here in slavery. So we had a great conversation. But all of that's reminded me of the importance of what I'm trying to do over here as a part of that tradition. So,
and please take this as a compliment, you're older than you look. You grew up in Charleston.
Older or younger than I look?
You're older than you look. You look younger than I think you look younger than you are. And
I'll be 60 in December, you know.
That's crazy. But that being said, you grew up in Charleston just as segregation was ending.
Correct.
And obviously you grew up on the peninsula, right?
Mount Pleasant.
Mount Pleasant.
Right.
What besides the obvious, the population growing, all the development that we've seen, what has been the most profound social change that you've witnessed in your lifetime of growing up and living in Charleston post segregation? What was that period like as the city integrated its institutions, and what was your experience like in the midst of that?
It was in the third year of my education that I began going to desegregated schools in 1971 at Mount Pleasant Academy, which, in spite of its name, is a public elementary school. That school had already been desegregated for about 2 years by that point. I'd been in two previous segregated schools before that. So I started going to the desegregated school on September 1st, 1971. And a white teacher named Birdie Sanders took me, Birdie Sanders, not Bernie Sanders, okay? She took me under her wing because she saw that I liked to recite and read and write my own stories and all of that, and was a major source of encouragement for me, even though she was a white lady from Hemingway, South Carolina. So that taught me at a very early age that color alone had little to do with the issue of good versus evil. But as I got older, I began to see the realities of this, how kids would throw rocks at me and call me the N-word when I was riding my bike in their neighborhoods, things like that, and even adults telling me to leave their property when I walked into certain neighborhoods, that sort of thing I experienced as a boy. And when I was at Moultrie Middle School in 1976, they were welcoming in the elementary school kids, and the DJs at a dance, and the DJ played Enjoy Yourself by the Jackson 5. And so I got up and started doing just that with a young white girl I knew in elementary school. And the teacher went crazy and asked me, "What is your name?" And I'm like, "Damon Fordham." And then she realized I wasn't breaking any rules and left me alone. So those things were the baptism of fire for me, you could say, when it comes to issues of race. And of course, they would not teach African-American history in the classrooms in those days because they feared that it would start riots among the students. But at the same time, I was in the library reading things like Langston Hughes' Pictorial History of the Negro in America, and Eyewitness, The Negro in American History by William Loren Katz, and things like that. So that was basically my antidote to a lot of the nonsense that was going on around me in those days. And as I mentioned earlier, because of that and the storytelling of my parents, and later at University of South Carolina meeting Dean Willie Harriford, who encouraged me in this direction, this was how I managed to overcome a lot of those things psychologically.
I can't imagine. Although one interesting observation, I think we recently participated. Maybe it's not that recently. Time goes very quickly. In a discussion at the International African American Museum that you invited me to participate in, and we talked about our experiences of going respectively to Africa and Israel, and the idea of living in a diaspora and the challenges that come with that, and the joy of returning to your spiritual homeland where your ancestors were. And I'm reminded of a parallel. I was just recently in Israel, and I had the opportunity to go to a school where that was very unique. In Israel, even within the Jewish community sector, the Jewish sectors of society or tribes, their public schools are not standardized for the whole country. They fund several parallel school systems that kids can go to. The Haredim, who are very religious, have their own set of schools that are publicly funded. And the Datsi Lumi, the modern Orthodox, have their own religious nationalists. They have their own schools that they send their kids to. And then there are the Hiloni or secular schools where most students go who are Jewish. And although they're supposed to be secular, they still have a little infusion of religion in them that folks would like to see gone. And then there's a very small minority among the mixed cities. And when I say mixed cities, I mean cities where Jews and Arabs live together, somewhat integrated, where some of those secular schools Arab students go to, but by and large, and learn in Hebrew, but by and large, Arab Israelis go to Arab Israeli schools where they can learn a lot of their subjects in Arabic, since that's the language that they primarily speak. And certainly they also have their own private schools, which are some of the most elite private schools in the country. But I say all this to say, when I went to go visit Israel, I had the opportunity to go to a school in Haifa where Israeli and Arab students learn together, and almost one for one. And they learn simultaneously in Hebrew and in Arabic. And so the Jewish students learn Arabic and about the Muslim holidays, and the Arab students learn Hebrew, and they learn the Jewish holidays. And it's actually become like a great project of social integration, because the Jewish students are more excited about their own religious identities because they get to share them with their Muslim classmates, have them over for Sukkot, and their families have become friends outside of the school. And I got the opportunity to speak to them, and I brought up that that in our schools here in the South, that's not so long ago, in my mother's generation, the schools were segregated, and they were segregated by law, and that it was a great period of positive social change when those schools were integrated, and it was those kids that were brave enough to integrate the schools, like yourself, like Millicent and other folks that we know who were some of the first to integrate Charleston County schools, are now seen as heroes, and that I believe that these young people would also be seen as heroes for choosing to go to this school. And they found that very very humorous. But in a place like Israel, where there's so much conflict between groups of people, it strikes me that one of the biggest problems that they have is that they live separately. Do you think that the legal integration of Charleston County schools improved the relationships between Black and white Charlestonians?
First, I want to correct something. I was not Millicent Brown and her group desegregated the schools in 1963, the year before I was born. So right. I was in that second or third wave that came, because I did that 8 years later. So Millicent and them, I was in the second or third wave of desegregated students. So there were many others who did that before myself and my group. But we were among the earliest to do it from an early age onward, because most of them did that in high school, you see.
Right.
Went to segregated elementary schools and such. Just wanted to make that clarification. But
Sure.
The answer is, as far as I'm concerned, undoubtedly yes. Because, people tend to look at things in absolutes. And those of us who went to desegregated schools in those days, a lot of us dealt with a lot of very negative situations going on. And that's kind of true on both sides, because you had cases where a lot of the Black kids were very resentful toward the advantages of the white kids and were very hateful and bullying toward them too. So what the white kids, on the other hand, some of the white kids had the teachers on their sides when they were bigoted. So there was negativity on that end, but many of the people who I attended the desegregated schools with from childhood are my friends 50 years later. I went to the 60th birthday party of a kid named Rob Nance, who I met in fourth grade in 1974, when we were both reading his comic books in the teacher's class. The teacher took him away from us, and we're still friends many years later. When I went to the slave port in Senegal, West Africa, Gorée Island, needless to say, it was a traumatic experience. A young white lady who I went to the elementary school with, named Karen McKenzie, she messaged me by saying that she hoped that this would not be such a stress on my brain and that I would take time to process this once I got back to America. And the fact that she would send that message to me halfway around the world while I was going through something like that, even though she was not of the ethnic group that would immediately relate to that, that touched my heart. And so when I got back and we went out to lunch, I made it a point to make sure to tell her that. So experiences like that, I mean, to me, are priceless in that whereas our parents saw each other as total strangers. One kid told me that his parents wouldn't let him go to my neighborhood because they were afraid of what would happen. And I told him that my parents were afraid to let me go to their neighborhood because they were afraid that I'd get lynched like Emmett Till or something. But there has been improvements. And see, here's the thing about that. We have to acknowledge both the positive as well as the negative, because you see, some people feel that if we only deal with the negative and the tragedy, that people would get complacent. People would not get complacent. That would encourage people to get fired up if we simply stress those things. And some people feel that if we brought up the positive things, it would make people complacent and not want to do anything about the negative. I say we have to talk about both. We have to talk about the triumphs as well as the tragedies, because if you don't talk about the tragedies, they'll repeat themselves again. But if you don't talk about the triumphs, the people will lose hope, and you cannot make progress without hope.
Absolutely. I think that so much fear of the other comes from lack of understanding and exposure and relationships. And it's actually a perfect lead into my next question. So obviously you and I are friends. We've known each other since before I worked in this job, and
9 years.
Wow. So you've assigned a number to it. So 9 years we've been friends, but apart from our relationship as Jewish Charlestonian, Black Charlestonian, two activists who know each other, you have devoted time to building a relationship with and mutual understanding with our Jewish community. You participated in a program called Operation Understanding?
Yes, sir.
Operation Understanding, that took you on a tour of the South, where you saw synagogues that were, I think, attacked, along with churches that were attacked during the civil rights movement. And beyond that, you've devoted time to programs that promote understanding between Jewish people and Black people and Black Jewish people, because it's not necessarily two distinct groups there, but we'll save that discussion for another time. We recently had a clergy cohort, Black Jewish clergy cohort, visiting from New York to Charleston that you spoke to. Why have you devoted your time to this operation of mutual understanding, and why do you feel that the relationship between Black and Jewish Charleston is important, if it is? That's kind of what this program is all about.
Okay, first of all, I do that with a number of groups along with the Jewish people. I've participated in bridge building programs with, as well as Jewish people, with other groups of white people, as well as with my trips to Africa between African-born Africans and those of us who live in America today. I've done a lot of that because it's very simple, really. What I try to do is to get people to understand that there is more to life and the world than what they have been told. Because if all you know is what you see in front of you and what you have been told, you will be a very limited-minded person. And if you talk to somebody who's very limited in mind, it's a very unpleasant and monotonous experience. And so exposing yourself to different people and different things and all of that, it helps you understand that we as human beings have far more common than anybody cares to admit. So, and education is a great deal a part of that. So basically, when I see the results of ignorance, and the German scholar Johann Goethe was correct that there is nothing more frightening than ignorance and inaction, I just basically see what I do as being a soldier in the war against ignorance.
Well, our relationship has been one that I've treasured, and I found the same thing about this war against ignorance, and it's the reason why this program is called Bridges Not Walls. It's more than the name of the program. It's a philosophy that we're all better off when we're building bridges with each other, as opposed to building walls around our individual identities and communities. And I appreciate that you always devote your time to that exercise. And I found that we see the world in a very similar way, in ways that don't always happen within our own identity groups. I really appreciate your time, and I don't want to take up too much more of it, but
oh no, you're fine. You're fine.
What do you looking out at the current climate, compared to the times that you've written about, what do you see as the biggest challenge or biggest challenges that we have to overcome? And do you see hope in the candidacy, for example, of the first Black woman to be a party nominee for president? Do you think we're on the road to progress, or are devolving in some way?
Well, as far as Vice President Kamala Harris,
Nope. Did I freeze?
oh,
Hello.
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now, as I was about to say about Vice President Harris, I've noticed that over the last week that Ms. Harris has announced her candidacy, that there's been an outpouring of hope, and not just from Black women, but also women in general. I understand that there's been this movement called the White Women in Support of Kamala Harris that's raised millions on a Zoom network even last night or night before last. So that's giving hope not just to Black women, but to women in general, and people who don't like a lot of where society is going right now. And if people and see, hope is the key thing in this. If you do not have hope, you will not make progress. It is just that simple. And for the last few years, I've noticed that a lot of people have lacked hope in where these type of things are going to go. And part of that is because, you see, back in the 60s, you had these public voices of reason across the board. The John F. and Robert Kennedys, the Martin Luther Kings, and the Abraham Heschels and folks like that. And you can't find a person hardly nowadays who's a major public figure who speaks to a broad base of people along those lines as a voice of reason. Right now, you have people who, whenever they feel a certain emotion, they'll get on social media and just rant and rave and vent their emotions. And you'll appreciate this connection, a modern day Tower of Babel, where you have all this ranting and raving and din going on. It's like Ray Charles leading an army of Stevie Wonders across the street, by and large. So there's just all this confusion and rage. And so there needs to be public voices of reason that can corral the emotions of the people into positive directions to where things are constructive. And what I've often tried to do is to try to study and through my social media and such things, put the teachings of such people like that out there to give them better ideas along those lines.
Well, I've definitely seen you do that, and appreciate it, and I can see by the comments a lot of other people do as well. One of the challenges that I've seen on the horizon in terms of our political climate, besides not only now the social segregation, but also like media segregation, we're all consuming completely different stories about what is currently happening. How do you see us overcoming that separation, those echo chambers that we all find ourselves in? How do you do that?
It's simple to say, but hard for a lot of people to do. And that is to listen to people who you don't agree with, number one, to get some ideas of exactly where they are with a whole lot of things. Just don't be, because again, what I dislike about our time is the sense of absolutism, the self-righteousness of so many people. And, when you go around thinking that you're woke and all this sort of thing, and that you are in this idea of moral certainty and so forth, the great Esau Jenkins, a local Black leader here who was killed in a car crash in 1972, man with a fourth grade education who owned businesses throughout the Charleston through the Myrtle Beach area. He once said that he who thinks he knows everything has a lot to learn. And I understand that while I'm a teacher for a living, I'm a student of life until I'm dead. Because you see, as long as I have a conversation with somebody, even if I don't agree with that person, I'm learning something. So take time to learn exactly where the other person is coming from, and don't just stick to media and read things that you agree with. Because even when I was at the University of South Carolina, an article quoted me as saying that we're here for an education, and as long as we have speakers that we agree with, we aren't learning anything. So take time to go beyond your comfort zones and your media that tells you what you want to hear, because that's what that is really. It's just a business more than a source of education if they're just being partisan to one political side, because there's no political party or ideology that has a total monopoly on truth. You have to take the time to look at these two things and come to a decision within yourself, which is correct and which isn't.
True words have never been spoken. The older I get, I learn that more and more, and I find that there's so much false urgency and hopelessness and alarmism, and it can weigh down on people. But obviously there are real problems and real challenges that we have to address, and the only way that we're going to effectively do that is by coming to consensus. I mentioned I just recently was in Israel, and when I left, I thought myself to be somebody that was very well learned about their political system and their social system. And when I got there and started hearing from these incredible speakers and folks who are making change in their social sectors, I realized just how little I know. And even as I learned from these people, I realized more and more how little I knew and know about what the problems and solutions facing that country are. And having said that, I've had conversations with some young people that are so profoundly certain about everything happening there, who I know have far less experience and knowledge about the problems that nation and the people in it face. But it's so often the people that know so little that are making decisions, that are demanding urgency, that are driving the debate. And it becomes increasingly hard in the age of social media to kind of filter that out. But maybe some of the solution is having experiences and conversations with people who think differently than you. where are the spaces that you find that can happen? Because it doesn't seem like social media is a space that fosters that kind of discussion between people who don't agree with each other in a productive way.
Well, you and I are talking right now, and we're on social media. Number one.
Enough.
So you can do, you don't necessarily need to rent out a space or have an organization to do that. You could do that kind of thing among individuals, okay? Because see, there are two things I want to say to that issue, okay? Back in ancient Egypt in about 2300 BCE, the 2,000 years before you had that Greek trinity of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the first philosopher we had of record was a man named Ptah-hotep, very wise Egyptian, who said these words. He said, "Do not be proud and arrogant with your knowledge, for knowledge can be found among women at the millstones." In other words, you can learn from anybody, okay? Even if they are not educated, even if they haven't been places, they all, at least in some part of their discourse, they will say something that is a profound truth based in their experience, which leads to the motto that I have nowadays. My motto used to be educate yourself to lead yourself, because if you wait on others to show you the way, you will wait for a long time. I stopped saying that because, you see, I could easily say that as a person who grew up with a very well-educated father, with a cohesive community, a strong church leader in my childhood, and all these adults that were looking after me. I had that privilege. But you see, a lot of young people today didn't grow up with that kind of nurturing. So it would be a bit presumptuous to expect them to do that. So my motto today is this: the more you learn there is to learn.
Absolutely. And, what you said about finding knowledge with women at the millstone, it strikes me that in a lot of the activist circles that you and I have both been, there's almost always a group that's, separate from the organizers that are and the people that are making things happen on the ground and having these dialogues. There's almost always like a group of academics somewhere remote from all of this activity that are saying, well, no, the real problem is this, and the real way to address it, based on everything that I've studied in the books that I've read about social change, is this. And so often I found in our activism that those solutions almost always don't translate neatly into the real world, and that in some cases, some of the most useful knowledge comes from talking to people on the street, or who show up and are willing to and have something at stake and experience to share. So I can relate to Ptah-hotep. Ptah-hotep?
Yeah.
I can relate to Ptah-hotep in that wisdom.
Go ahead.
I have pages of notes here and follow-up research to do. One of the things that you mentioned, and this isn't necessarily the natural flow of conversation here, but one of the things that you mentioned was Judge Wade's Waring
Right.
being run out of Charleston. I was not familiar with that story. Would you share more about that? I know Judge Waring was involved in the Brown versus Board of Education?
He was involved with the predecessor of that, which was Briggs versus Elliott, which was where a courageous Black couple out of Summerton, South Carolina, in 1951 sued because of the decrepit conditions of the Black schools, which was because the wealthy white power structure of that time wanted to keep the Blacks of South Carolina and other such states as illiterate as possible so that they could maintain them as a permanent class of cheap labor. It's important to understand that one of the main reasons behind racism in the country, is to begin with, is that the wealthy class of whites feared that the poor whites and their poverty and illiteracy and subjugation would find common cause with their Black brethren and come together to overthrow the rule of that wealthy class of whites. So they indoctrinated the poor whites with the idea that if black people had equality with them, the poor whites would be relegated to the bottom of society. In other words, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich, which is why we have racism in places like this. Now, so the black parents sued, and their lawyer was Thurgood Marshall. And so Judge Waring ruled in favor of them in that case, but he had two other white federal judges on the bench because it was a federal case. And the two other white federal judges, John Parker of North Carolina and George Belturman, of South Carolina, overruled him, and Thurgood Marshall appealed the case to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., which was Brown versus Board of Education. Now, having said all of that, Judge Waring also ruled in 1947 in a case called Elmore versus Rice. That was the case that allowed black people to vote in South Carolina, namely my parents' generation of such. And for things like this, he was hated by the white community and constantly hounded and harassed well into his 70s, as well as his wife. So he retired from the bench in 1952 and spent the rest of his life in New York. And when he died in May of 1968, they sent his body back down here. And at his funeral here in Charleston on a rainy day in 1968 were a total of 6 white people and over 300 blacks. And so Senator Ernest Fritz Hollings met with President Obama, and they agreed that the current name of the federal courthouse should be changed from the Ernest Fritz Hollings Judicial Center to the Judge Julius Waties Waring Judicial Center. So that's the kind of history that I think if more people knew about that, it would help bring them together.
Absolutely. You brought up Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman earlier, and
yes, sir.
I remember learning as a kid about them coming up missing, and that they had been killed by I think the local sheriff and KKK were both involved, and I can't express in words just how proud I was when I learned that the 2 white men in that group of 3 were Jews from, I believe, New York or Canada, Brooklyn, who were in the South registering people to vote, and it's part of our tradition that I've always been proud of. But I've always been struck also by that story about how it was that case that really was a profound catalyst for the awakening of white people up north to the plight of black people in the South. And it took 2 young white men being killed to garner the headlines that had been missing for a period of time. And although that's a profoundly depressing fact from that time period, or opinion from that time period, I think it speaks to the power of intergroup relations, of us crossing these boundaries between us to make a difference, to work on what's right. And I think when that happens, it tends to call more attention to the problems that we're facing. On that note, I am the only person in the Federation office today, and the doorbell just rang. And it's perfect timing because I have to go. But I so appreciate your time. I hope that folks continue to join us for these conversations. And I'm sure this won't be the last time that you and I do a program together. And I would encourage folks to stay tuned. I've been in discussions with the couple up in Conway, South Carolina, who were unfortunate victims of racial harassment, including a couple next to them burning a cross in the property adjacent to them. And I'm hoping that we can have them on to talk about how that situation was dealt with, and the ways that their town was able to come together to move those people out of that home. So stay tuned to hear more about that. Again, register if you haven't for the Congressional Candidate Forum. Professor Fordham, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. We'll definitely do a part 2 to this.
Awesome. And apologies again for being a little distracted here. We did suffer a loss here in our Federation family today, and I'm sure there'll be more about that later. But I appreciate everybody's patience and for tuning in. Have a great weekend. Shabbat Shalom for those of you that observe, and thanks again.
You're welcome.
Bye.